There are operations that unfold without ceremony. No declaration, no raised voices, no spectacle. Just a subtle shift in coordinates. A vessel changes course, a signal goes dark, and somewhere far from any coastline, helicopters appear over open water. The official language remains procedural, maritime interdiction, sanctions enforcement, right of visit. But when armed men descend onto a tanker in the middle of the Indian Ocean after weeks of silent tracking, it suggests something more deliberate than routine compliance. It suggests patience and preparation. The ship had left the Caribbean under circumstances that, at first glance, seemed incidental. A departure logged, a cargo declared, a transponder flickering inconsistently before disappearing altogether. For 6 weeks, it moved across oceans, altering identity markers, blending into traffic lanes that carry thousands of vessels every day. On paper, it was one tanker among many. In practice, it was being watched from the moment it cleared Venezuelan waters. That detail matters because sustained surveillance across that distance is not improvised. It is authorized. When American forces boarded the vessel in international waters, there was no resistance reported, no dramatic exchange, no visible escalation. The footage released later was controlled, almost clinical. Fast roping from helicopters onto steel decks, operators moving with rehearsed precision. The message was not emotional, it was structural. International waters are no longer assumed to be neutral space for sanctioned cargo. The maritime domain, once treated as vast and ambiguous, is being treated as mapped and monitored. What makes this particular interception difficult to dismiss is not the boarding itself. It is the pattern surrounding it. The tanker had been sanctioned months earlier, formally linked to networks already under financial restriction. Since 2023, it had carried crude connected to more than one sanctioned state. Russian origin, Iranian origin, Venezuelan origin. Same hull, same routes, same intermediaries. On paper, these supply chains appear fragmented, politically separate. In practice, they converge in steel and saltwater. And this is where the main thing begins, because a single vessel moving sanctioned oil is smuggling. A vessel repeatedly moving oil from multiple sanctioned jurisdictions under changing flags is logistics. Sustained logistics imply coordination. Coordination implies management. Management implies that what looks like 3 isolated problems may, in fact, be one integrated system. Almost simultaneously, on the other side of the Indian Ocean, 3 additional tankers were intercepted near Mumbai. Different names, similar behavior, mid-sea transfers designed to obscure origin, electronic signatures inconsistent with declared routes, identity changes that occurred too frequently to be accidental. The official explanation emphasized surveillance technology and data analysis. But technology does not choose timing. Timing suggests alignment. 9 days separate the American boarding and the Indian seizures. That window is narrow enough to raise questions, but wide enough to avoid obvious linkage. Publicly, these were separate enforcement actions. Privately, it becomes harder to treat them as unrelated when the same shipping patterns appear in both theaters. The same method of ship-to-ship transfers in international waters. The same use of neutral flags to rebrand cargo. The same evasion techniques that require both capital and intelligence to sustain. At first, the cargo volumes appear as numbers in a report. Nearly 2 million barrels on a single tanker. Multiply that across more than a dozen vessels that departed Venezuelan ports in close succession. 32 million barrels in motion within weeks. At prevailing market prices, the value crosses into the billions. It seems like a financial detail until you connect the sequence. Billions in sanctioned crude do not circulate without a distribution architecture. Insurance, brokers, port authorities willing to look away, banks prepared to process transactions through layered entities. The sanctioned tanker carried a Panamanian registration at one stage, Venezuelan crude at another, Iranian oil previously, Russian cargo before that. Official sanctions cited one jurisdiction in particular, not the country of departure, not the country of registration. The designation focused on Iran's shadow shipping apparatus. That nuance is rarely discussed openly. It implies that the vessel was not simply transporting oil from multiple regimes. It was embedded in an operational framework managed through a specific command structure. Meanwhile, statements from Tehran warned of reciprocal action. Threats to detain Western tankers in narrow straits, pledges to drain seized cargo as compensation. The rhetoric framed the boarding as piracy, but the mechanics mirror each other more than either side acknowledges. Maritime leverage applied through detention, cargo as bargaining chip, transit choke points as pressure valves. The difference, at least formally, rests on sanction regimes and legal framing. But at sea, legality is enforced by presence. There is another layer that receives less attention: the decision to release helicopter footage publicly. Special operations forces boarding a sanctioned tanker is not unprecedented. Broadcasting it is less common. Public release transforms enforcement into signaling. It informs not only the operators of shadow fleets, but also insurers, shipping registries, and financial intermediaries. It quietly adjusts risk calculations across the industry. If a vessel can be tracked from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean with its transponder off, then disappearing at sea is no longer a reliable tactic. And yet, the boarding itself resolves nothing. It captures one hull, perhaps a few more. But the network appears larger. Indian authorities identified a 30-vessel structure linked to a single management node based in the Gulf. 30 tankers capable of rotating identities, transferring cargo mid-ocean, and distributing oil from multiple sanctioned origins. If even a fraction of that network remains active, the financial throughput remains substantial. Tens of millions of barrels moving outside formal oversight. At this point, the system usually shows its limits. Sanctions are designed to isolate, but isolation creates incentive for integration among those excluded. Russia under pressure, Iran under pressure, Venezuela under pressure. Shared constraints often produce shared channels. The maritime domain becomes the connective tissue. Steel hulls replace diplomatic cables. Transponders replace embassies. What is less visible is the trade architecture unfolding in parallel. India, historically a significant importer of Iranian crude, reduced purchases years ago under external pressure. Now, Indian authorities are detaining vessels linked to that same supply chain. Officially, this is maritime security. Unofficially, it coincides with deeper economic alignment elsewhere. Timing in geopolitics rarely floats independently of trade. The broader question remains unspoken. If this network has operated since 2023, moving oil across jurisdictions under sanction, how many transactions cleared before interception? How many cargoes were blended, relabeled, and sold into markets that prefer plausible deniability over disruption? And how many vessels remain in motion right now, engines humming, AIS signals toggled strategically, assuming that open water still provides cover? The boarding in the Indian Ocean may look decisive, but decisive actions sometimes indicate that something has already expanded beyond quiet containment. When multiple enforcement operations occur across different oceans within days, it suggests that tracking capacity has matured. It also suggests that tolerance has narrowed. And when tolerance narrows at sea, escalation does not begin with speeches. It begins with coordinates. The fracture point was not the boarding itself. It was the architecture that became visible once the hull was secured and the paperwork examined. Because what appeared to be a vessel under sanction was, in operational terms, a mobile junction. Bills of lading did not simply list cargo, they revealed rotation. Insurance documents did not simply cover risk, they showed repetition. The same brokers, the same intermediaries, the same layered ownership structures appearing across voyages linked to 3 separate sanctioned states. It was not coincidence, it was design. The mechanism is neither chaotic nor improvised. A tanker loads crude in one jurisdiction under sanction. Before reaching open market ports, it meets a second vessel in international waters. Ship-to-ship transfer occurs beyond territorial patrol ranges. The receiving vessel carries a neutral flag, often recently changed. Documentation reflects a blended cargo origin that becomes difficult to trace without satellite correlation and forensic chemical analysis. By the time the oil reaches refining hubs, its geopolitical origin is statistically diluted. On paper, it is simply crude. This system relies on 3 pillars. First, flag fluidity. Registries willing to process rapid reflagging create plausible administrative distance between cargo and origin. Second, AIS manipulation. Transponders toggled strategically create controlled blind spots, long enough to complete transfers, but short enough to avoid prolonged anomaly detection. Third, financial layering. Payments routed through intermediary trading firms, often registered in permissive jurisdictions, fragment liability across entities that dissolve as quickly as they form. What changed is not the existence of this method. It has existed for years. What changed is the synchronization of enforcement. Satellite monitoring has become continuous rather than episodic. Data pattern analysis now flags not just individual vessels, but behavioral clusters. When a tanker repeatedly meets others in low-traffic maritime corridors, deviates from declared routes, and rotates identifiers within predictable intervals, the anomaly becomes structural. The vessel is no longer an outlier. It becomes a node. The seizure near Mumbai revealed something further. The 3 detained tankers were not isolated smugglers. They were components of a managed fleet. 30 vessels linked through a centralized handler network operating from a Gulf jurisdiction that offers logistical convenience and financial opacity. Central management reduces friction. Crews rotate through affiliated companies. Maintenance and insurance are negotiated collectively. Routing decisions are optimized to minimize exposure to predictable patrol patterns. This is how sanctioned oil reaches markets without visible political sponsorship. It does not move as contraband. It moves as inventory managed through distributed risk. Each vessel carries millions of barrels. Multiplied across 30 hulls, the throughput approaches volumes that rival mid-sized national exports. The revenue stream, even after discounts, generates billions annually. That capital does not sit idle. It funds procurement, stabilizes currency reserves, sustains internal security structures. Sanctions aim to constrict. This architecture restores liquidity. The coordination between Washington and New Delhi alters the equation. India's maritime enforcement capability now integrates satellite inputs, AI-driven anomaly detection, and shared intelligence feeds. The decision to act against vessels historically tied to Iranian supply chains represents more than compliance. It signals that access to Indian ports and trade frameworks carries conditional alignment with sanction enforcement. This reduces safe docking options across the northern Indian Ocean. Shipping routes must elongate, costs rise, exposure windows widen. Yet disruption remains incremental. Seizing one tanker removes 2 million barrels from circulation. Intercepting 3 removes 6. But a 30-vessel fleet can absorb episodic losses if pricing compensates for risk. The question becomes whether enforcement remains episodic or transitions into sustained attrition. FBI statements indicating additional interceptions suggest a campaign model rather than isolated raids. Sustained campaigns impose cumulative uncertainty. Insurance premiums spike. Crews hesitate to sign contracts. Flag registries reconsider exposure. Retaliation calculus complicates this trajectory. Threats to detain Western tankers in choke points such as Hormuz introduce reciprocal risk. Maritime insurance markets respond first to uncertainty. If reciprocal seizures escalate, freight rates adjust globally. Energy prices respond not only to supply loss, but to transit volatility. A shadow fleet that once operated in gray space becomes catalyst for overt maritime confrontation. There is also a structural implication that remains understated. When sanctioned regimes integrate logistics, they reduce their dependency on sympathetic state actors. The network becomes semi-autonomous. It does not require formal alliance treaties. It requires shared exclusion from Western financial systems. The maritime domain becomes their common corridor. Disrupting that corridor demands multilateral enforcement across oceans. Partial enforcement leaves adaptive space. What intelligence analysts will examine now is persistence. The 6-week tracking of a single vessel with its transponder disabled indicates deep surveillance penetration. If such tracking becomes standard, the advantage of AIS manipulation diminishes. However, surveillance capacity is finite. Monitoring 30 vessels continuously across hemispheres strains resources. Prioritization decisions must be made. Some ships will move unimpeded while others are intercepted to maintain deterrence optics. At this stage, the system does not collapse. It recalibrates. Routes shift farther south. Transfers occur in less trafficked latitudes. Ownership chains grow more opaque. But each adaptation increases operational cost and extends transit time. Profit margins narrow. The question is whether the network's financial return justifies rising exposure. There is no immediate resolution. The seizure in the Indian Ocean was a tactical success. The coordinated detentions near Mumbai were operational signals. The broader contest is logistical endurance versus surveillance endurance. If enforcement sustains tempo and expands partner alignment, the shadow fleet contracts gradually. If enforcement attention diffuses, the network resumes steady throughput, absorbing occasional losses as business expense. The uncomfortable reality is that the maritime system itself is being tested. International waters were long treated as frictionless arteries of trade. They are becoming monitored corridors where sanction lines are enforced physically rather than symbolically. When boarding actions occur thousands of miles from origin ports, the notion of geographic sanctuary erodes. And once geographic sanctuary erodes, escalation thresholds move closer together, not announced, not declared, simply recalculated.